Ash sat alone in his candlelit chamber, a faint glow pulsing between his fingers. The dungeon had given him more than survival. It had given him options. The gloves of screams materialized around his hand, an SR-grade relic that amplified magic critical rate with every consecutive kill, 30 levels above anything he should own at this stage. Every piece of the scream set now sat in his inventory. Boots, crown, gloves, a full collection that no player on a normal difficulty run would assemble this early. Something about the drop rates felt wrong. Too generous, too convenient, but suspicion was a luxury he could not afford, so he filed it away and turned to the blacksmith orders instead. He promised himself he would hand out the new equipment once the full party gathered. Until then, the gamer in him wanted to see what else the system had been hiding. The reward screen flashed: advanced magic potions, a dungeon escape teleport scroll, status recovery potions. He dragged each one into storage without hesitation. The door swung open to reveal a room so bare it looked confiscated. No decoration, no personality, just documents stacked like barricades and a chessboard no one played. Ader sat among his paperwork, round glasses catching the lamplight, already mid-thought before Ash had crossed the threshold. The man had been expecting this visit. Ash's thoughts circled back to the thing he could not say aloud. That his aide had not only met the player directly, but seemed to enjoy the chess match of it. Ash noted with grim satisfaction that his aide looked fine for someone sharing a fortress with a vampire. Living well enough for a man posted to the graveyard of the Empire. The real concern sat between them like a loaded crossbow. Damien's red eyes had surfaced during the dungeon, and while no one died this time, the margin had been uncomfortably thin. An army commander who tolerated a vampire crossing the line once was pragmatic. An army commander who let it happen twice was dead. Ash needed a countermeasure, and Ader knew it. The chessboard between them held its pattern. Ader reminded him that inside this grand game, most moves were legal. The question was never whether Ash could act, but whether the cost was survivable. Ash turned the problem over in his head. The side profile of a prince who had learned to think 3 steps past the obvious. Equipping Damien with Mistiltine, the star-silver blade forged to kill vampires, was the obvious play, but obvious plays in this game had a way of becoming tomorrow's funeral. Ash imagined the worst case: the party wiped, the screen flashing those 2 words every gamer dreads. No continues, no reload, just silence and an empty fortress. Then Ader said something that made the gamer brain light up. A system notification chimed, and Ash felt the familiar rush of discovering a mechanic nobody had documented. The Achievement Points exclusive store, a hidden shop that had unlocked itself without announcement, stocked with exactly one item that mattered: the emergency escape bomb. 45,000 points for a single consumable. It stunned surrounding monsters, boosted party speed by 100%, and burned 1 dungeon escape teleport scroll per use. For half a second, the prince who managed budgets and bribed cities hesitated. 45,000 points was not a purchase. It was a bet on a future disaster. His finger hit the purchase button before the hesitation finished its sentence. Insurance against annihilation was not a line item you negotiated. The function integrated into his system immediately. A faint pulse ran through his body, and the prince felt the weight of a safety net he prayed he would never need. Ader adjusted his glasses and offered a thought that landed like a grenade. The stage boss mechanics could be exploited, not just survived. If Ash could control when and where a boss appeared, the threat became a resource. Every commander who ever won a siege knew that the monster at your gate was also the monster, not at someone else's. Ash locked eyes with the close-up of his own reflection in the dark. His pupil narrowed to a point, the kind of focus that preceded either brilliance or catastrophe. The strategy crystallized: use the system's own architecture against itself. Everything depended on how Ash deployed the tools he had collected, not the tools themselves. Ash murmured Ader's name under his breath, equal parts suspicion and grudging respect. This man always seemed to know exactly where the hidden doors were. The blacksmith's hammer rang through the morning air at the Crossroad forge. Overnight, Ash's commissioned equipment had come together, and the results exceeded every specification. Jupiter stood rigid as the fortification armor materialized around her frame. Level 7, gold-trimmed, with defensive stats that would make a royal guard weep with envy. She hesitated before the mirror, as though the armor might vanish if she admitted she wanted it. A mercenary trained to expect betrayal from every employer did not know how to accept a gift. The system informed them both of the catch: the negative trait Gold Lover would be forcibly applied to whoever wore the set. A compulsion toward greed baked into the metal itself. But Jupiter already carried that trait like an old scar. Ash had chosen her precisely because the penalty would cost nothing. The armor had always been hers. The set completion notification chimed, and the mage told Jupiter to take everything, every item, every bonus, every curse that came with it. Jupiter's lips parted into something between a smile and a threat. 30 years of mercenary work, and no commander had ever outfitted her like this. She thanked the prince with a stiffness that almost cracked into real gratitude. Behind her, an orb of energy pulsed in her palm. Evidence that the armor was already syncing with her magic. Jupiter's aide watched from behind with an expression that was equal parts shock and something close to grief. He had not seen his commander accept kindness in decades. Night fell over Crossroad. In Jupiter's room, the silence held the weight of old wounds. She peeled back her glove to find the damage worse than before. The vampire lord's residual spell had taken root in her hand, and every attempt to study the magic carved deeper into her flesh. Pain was just information. Jupiter had survived the vampire lord's spell in the Colosseum, and inside that near death she had found something worth bleeding for: new knowledge. She channeled magic through the wounded hand, tracing the vampire lord's spell structure. If she could decode the pattern, she could make the enemy's weapon her own. The spell responded. New knowledge took shape in her grip, blue light spiraling through damaged fingers. The cost was written in blood, but the reward was evolution. She flexed her bruised hand and asked herself the quiet question every aging soldier eventually faces: even if this power becomes mine, how much longer can this body carry it? Her aide's voice cut through the silence like a blade through fog. He had always hated watching her chase magic. He had been shouting that same warning for 10 years. Jupiter dismissed the thought with practiced ease. Useless worries, she told herself. The same thing she had told herself at 20, at 30, at 40. A knock broke the reverie. Sharp, insistent, the kind of knock that belonged to someone who had never once hesitated at a door. Ash stood in the doorway, and Jupiter tucked her bleeding hand behind her back with the speed of someone who had been hiding injuries her entire career. But the blood on her fingers told its own story. Fangs visible between her lips, her vampire heritage betrayed by the pain she refused to show. Ash called her grandmother. Not Dame Jupiter, not Commander. Grandmother. The word landed like a stone in still water, and for a moment nobody breathed. Her hand hung at her side, blood dripping from fingers that had gripped swords, cast spells, and once, in another life, held a child who called her the same thing. 10 years ago, on the Everblack Empire's eastern frontier, a different Jupiter woke to a child's voice, and a world that still had room for small, ordinary mornings. The girl was relentless, shaking her awake before dawn. There was work to do, bread to earn, and a grandmother who slept like the dead after every night shift at the village guard post. Jupiter yawned and asked if she really had to work today. The answer was written on the empty cupboard in the girl's impatient stare. The job paid poorly, but it was Jupiter's job. Village guard on the edge of an empire that had forgotten this place existed. She went every day because the alternative was nothing. But mornings like this one, with warm stew on the table and the girl's single gold eye watching her eat, Jupiter could almost pretend the world outside their door did not exist. The girl demanded to be fed, and Jupiter sighed with the practiced exhaustion of someone who had raised a child entirely alone. She lifted the spoon to the girl's waiting mouth. The girl fed her back, laughing, and for a moment Jupiter forgot that her only skill was violence and her only talent was magic that broke everything it touched. The prince in the present ate his own meal in silence, a butler at his side. The same bread, the same stew, a world apart in every way that mattered. Jupiter chewed slowly in the memory and confessed aloud that she was completely disqualified to be a grandmother. She could cast spells but could not cook a single meal worth eating. The girl slept peacefully beside other children in the village shelter. Jupiter stayed up alone and stirred the pot, determined to get the stew right at least once before morning. The pot bubbled at last. Jupiter tasted it and decided it was close enough. Every grandmother learns to cook eventually, even one whose hands were built for war. The girl embraced her, fierce and sudden, proud of her grandmother for trying. Jupiter stood rigid in the hug, a soldier who had never learned the stance for receiving love. Back on the Eastern Front, Jupiter spent her wages treating children hit by stray magic. The money vanished before payday, every single month, and she never once considered stopping. The girl announced they were out of living expenses again, and Jupiter sighed the sigh of a woman whose budget had never once survived contact with her own conscience. Jupiter arrived at the village guard post the next morning. Children lined up and saluted her with the kind of sloppy discipline that only real affection produces. Her aide sat across from her in the present, asking if nothing much had happened. Jupiter held the question in her mouth like a soldier holding a wound closed, because the answer required remembering a life she had spent 30 years trying to leave behind. A man sat behind iron bars, sweat beading on his forehead as a woman in dark military attire studied him from the other side. He gripped the bars and begged her to reconsider, promising her 40% if she looked the other way. His voice cracked with desperation, pitching a side hustle that could make them both rich. Jupiter said nothing. Her boots scraped against the wooden floor as she stepped closer, and the smuggler flinched at the sound. His customers wanted their product, he insisted. Everyone would win. The silence that followed his pitch was its own kind of answer. Jupiter slammed her hand on the desk with enough force to end the conversation. A blade flashed in the dim light as she drew it, not to threaten, but to punctuate a point. She was done listening. The smuggler screamed as magical energy erupted around his cell, crackling blue light flooding the cramped room. His shrieks echoed off the stone walls while Jupiter stood unmoved, her sword still humming with residual power. Even restrained, she radiated the kind of authority that made grown men forget how to breathe. Bare feet touched wet sand at the water's edge, waves lapping against scarred ankles. Jupiter walked the shoreline alone, the salt air carrying away whatever tension the interrogation had left behind. Workers hauled crates through the port district behind her, the rhythm of commerce grinding forward without pause. Security in the region had been deteriorating for years, she observed. Even 5 years ago, smugglers would never have dared operate so openly. The memory hit without warning. Flames swallowed fortress walls and siege engines crumbled as border security collapsed across the Empire's outer territories. Jupiter had lived through the worst of it. She wanted nothing more than to live quietly and peacefully until the children in her care grew up. But the world kept finding ways to deny her that single modest wish, because she lived with children who needed more than peace could provide. The word left her lips before she could catch it. Magic. Her one good eye went wide with recognition as she inspected a crate of seized contraband. Tobacco leaves, certainly, but buried underneath them were components for advanced healing spells. Her mind raced. A flash of blue light exploded outward as she tested the materials, confirming their potency with her own mana. Then she was running. Her hand found a small shoulder in the darkness, pulling a blonde child close. The child looked up with one frightened eye, asking if Jupiter was all right, but it was the child who was trembling. Jupiter crouched in the dirt and held the child tight, whispering reassurances she was not sure she believed herself. The other children would starve if Jupiter did not find the money, and every legal path had already been exhausted. Junior, the eldest of the orphans, stepped forward to shield her siblings with a courage no child should have needed to summon. The blonde girl clung to Jupiter with hollow eyes and the faintest wheeze of a cough that never quite went away. Jupiter looked down at the child pressed against her chest and felt something inside her crack along an old fault line. Blood trickled from the child's nose as she whispered that she did not feel well. The building behind them loomed dark against a bruised twilight sky. Inside, Jupiter pressed a glowing hand against the girl's frail chest, blue light pulsing through translucent skin. The healing magic fought to hold the damage at bay, but Jupiter's reversed mana flow turned every attempt into a slow drain. The magic scars covering Jupiter's own body were causing her power to flow backwards, and she could feel it weakening with each session. It was more than a medical problem. It was a countdown she could not stop, and the child had nothing but skin and bones left to spend. A local healer told her the treatment would be expensive, far beyond what a discharged soldier could afford. The only real option was the central temple in the capital, but Jupiter had no money for that either. Jupiter sat at the kitchen table staring at the cost written on a scrap of paper, doing math that would never add up on a soldier's pension. The kid had nothing but skin and bones, and the treatment demanded gold she could not earn honestly in 10 lifetimes. In reality, Jupiter's well-meaning care was slowly killing the girl, because improvised healing magic without proper materials was poisoning what it was meant to repair. Jupiter slammed her fist against the bed frame. That damned money stood between her children and survival. The night she made her decision, the port town sat dark and quiet around a house full of sleeping orphans. The only bridge across the gap was a crime, and Jupiter crossed it without looking back. A shadow appeared in the doorway of the smuggler's cell. Jupiter had returned not as an officer of the law, but as a customer. The deal that followed happened in whispers. Days blurred together as Jupiter's operation took shape. Jupiter asked the smuggler to tell her more about the arrangement he had proposed earlier, and the scene faded into the passage of days. Heavy sacks of contraband healing supplies piled up in Jupiter's storeroom, purchased with money that came from places she refused to name. The two women in the kitchen prepared dinner while children laughed in the next room, oblivious to the cost of their meals. Jupiter stood among the children, watching their faces light up at toys and food she had no honest way to explain. She handed the eldest a book, and the girls smiled with a warmth that made the crime feel almost worth it. Junior clutched the book to her chest, beaming, while Jupiter patted her head and told her not to worry about anything except reading. The girl handed the book over gently, and for one perfect moment the household felt like a real family. Jupiter reassured the child that everything would be fine, then turned toward the window where sunlight cut across the floor. She had more than a penny or two saved in her emergency funds, she admitted, trying to sound confident for the children. But confidence could not outrun Imperial investigators. They were competent, and Jupiter's smuggling trades soon came to light. Administering advanced healing magic to 10 children was the deciding factor. It was magic too expensive for a demoted soldier to afford. The investigators arrived, the smugglers confessed, and Jupiter did not protest. She accepted the verdict without a word. The eldest child asked about her cooking, a mundane question that carried the weight of a daughter speaking to a mother who might not come home. The result of dedicating her entire life to the military met a futile end. She called it karma. That night, Jupiter stood outside her home under a moonlit sky, alone with the silence and the cost of what she had chosen. Smoking suppressed the anxiety about committing injustice and crime, but it could not suppress the question of what came next. Years earlier, a small blonde child had stood before Jupiter in a stone corridor, trembling with excitement. The girl declared that she wanted to grow up to be just like Jupiter, a great mage who could earn money and protect people. Jupiter placed a hand on the child's small shoulder, telling her not to worry about anything except growing up strong. Junior's grandmother was fine, Jupiter insisted, her voice steady even as her single visible eye betrayed something deeper. But the door creaked open one morning to a child's voice calling for a grandmother who did not answer. Jupiter's fist clenched at her side, absorbing the grief so the children would not have to. The memory carried forward into the present, where Jupiter shouted in protest at the unfairness of it all. Junior lay in bed, magic scars glowing faintly as reversed mana currents ate away at her from within. Jupiter stared at the child in silence, her one uncovered eye searching for an answer she already knew did not exist. The blonde girl looked up from her pillow with that same trusting eye she had carried since childhood. Two pairs of hands reached for the same book, one steady and one fragile, meeting in the space between duty and love. Jupiter understood that no prison sentence or military tribunal would ever hurt as much as failing this one child. Jupiter stood alone on the harbor boardwalk, the sea wind pulling at her dark hair as she weighed what was left of her options. She mused aloud about where to earn money now, half joking about becoming a fisherman. Behind her, the port cranes and masts framed a woman who had lost everything except the people she was trying to save. A voice called her name. She turned to find a well-dressed man approaching with associates in tow. Jupiter asked whether he was here to mock her discharge. His answer was immediate and sincere. No way. He asked a question that changed everything. Whether Dame Jupiter had any interest in becoming a mercenary. Jupiter's exposed eye flared with mana at the word, suspicion and desperate hope fighting for dominance across her face. Given her situation, the man continued. A woman of her talents could make a sizable fortune in the mercenary trade. He reached into his coat and produced a lacquered box, flipping it open with the confidence of a man who already knew the answer. Inside sat a sum large enough to keep 10 orphans fed and healed, and Jupiter's single eye locked onto it with the intensity of a soldier who had just found her next battlefield. A man with an eye patch and a confident smile made a promise no one asked him to keep. He would leave, earn his fortune, and return before anyone missed him. But the silver-haired boy called Junior already knew the truth behind that grin. The nightmares had started weeks ago, and neither of them could sleep without the other close enough to hear breathing. On quiet nights, the boy pressed close and spoke of bad dreams as though naming them would keep them from coming true. Side by side, they weathered the years, two people sharing warmth in a world that offered none freely. But the medals Jupiter wore told a different story than the one she lived. She had sold every scrap of the reputation she spent a lifetime building. Afterwards, she wandered alone through battlefields and back alleys, taking contracts no sane fighter would accept. She fought without glory, bled without witness, and the honor she once carried rusted into a memory no one bothered to keep. Present day, Fortress City Crossroad, the Eddy Motel, first floor. Three figures sat around a candlelit table, and the silence between them could have cracked a plate. Ash studied the mood like a battlefield, unsure which of his dinner companions was more likely to start a fight. The restaurant owner swept in with a whole roasted bird and a beaming smile, offering everything on the house. Her eagerness to impress the young lord was impossible to miss. The steak hit the table and a fork pierced the meat before anyone could blink. Ash barely had time to register the speed. Jupiter, the disgraced dame of 30 years, was already tearing into the meal with the focus of someone who had missed far too many. She declared it delicious and shoved a plate toward the owner, calling her grandma without a second thought. The restaurant owner froze. Ash recognized the social disaster unfolding in real time. Then the eye-patched aide spoke up, stunned by the claim of a sudden attack on their food supply. Ash mentioned her grandmother, testing whether the word carried any weight. Jupiter's expression hardened instantly. She made it clear, that woman was not her grandmother. Never had been, never would be. The venom behind those words told Ash everything the mercenary file had left out. Ash and Jupiter stood together at the counter, and for the first time he heard the shape of her history from her own mouth. Her health was failing. The body that had survived 30 years of exile was finally sending its invoice. A chair scraped. Something heavy slid across the table. Jupiter promised to use every piece of equipment Ash had given her, and in the same breath reminded him she would outlast him on the battlefield. The sheer stubbornness of the statement made Ash pause. She refused to waste good steel on a body she considered temporary. The aide watched in silence, his single eye unreadable. Ash addressed Jupiter directly, acknowledging that her grudge ran deeper than any contract could cover. Jupiter leaned back, and for the first time all evening her guard dropped by a fraction. The conversation turned to something Ash had not planned for: family. Jupiter's family trouble was older than his borrowed body and twice as sharp. Ash sat with that realization quietly, turning it over. Everyone at this table carried damage they did not advertise. Jupiter caught him staring and asked if he was paying for dinner, breaking the weight of the moment with a grin. Ash reflected that this bastard prince he was wearing had more family trouble than even a transmigrated gamer could untangle. Morning broke over Crossroad, and Ash had already moved to the next problem. If the dinner was about loyalty, the dawn was about steel. Ash gathered the party at the forge, and the moment Lucas lifted the new blade, every doubt about the blacksmith's skill evaporated. He called it the finest sword he had ever held. Ash confirmed it with a grin, because he had spent every scrap of Mistiltane's star-silver ore to make it happen. The weapon was not just sharp, it was built to kill things that refused to stay dead. Ash laid out the properties with the calm of a man reading a shop menu: double damage against unholy enemies, defense ignoring true damage, and a healing reduction effect that would cripple regeneration. He would not extort payment from people who might not survive the week. The gear was free, and so was the expectation that they would use it to stay alive. The star-silver longsword of mortality appeared on the system window. SSR rank, level 40. With every anti-undead modifier the game's designers could stack into one blade. Ash studied the stat card like a love letter. Then he turned to Evangeline and asked for her lance. She handed it over without hesitation, and Calibe went to work. The old blacksmith fused the star-silver directly onto Evangeline's personal weapon, a trick Ash had gambled on precisely because this was reality, not a game with locked equipment slots. The result kept both her personal bonuses and the star-silver properties intact. Evangeline held the upgraded lance, and her reaction was immediate, unfiltered joy. This was equipment with power beyond anything a frontier garrison should possess. The bald blacksmith and Ash both understood that. Evangeline tested the balance, swinging the lance in wide arcs while laughing, and Lucas watched with a soldier's quiet approval. Evangeline reported no change in weight despite the modification. The lance felt identical, which meant Calibe's craftsmanship had absorbed the new material without disrupting the weapon's center of gravity. Ash noted the detail and filed it. Then came the star-silver arrows, and the room shifted. Damien held them with the reverence of a priest handling relics, which, given what he was, carried a bitter edge. The blind cleric promised to use them well, calling Calibe master without irony. The blacksmith paused. This friend, he noted, had extremely good eyes for someone who could not see. Then the bonus arrived. A crossbow forged from leftover Mistiltane, presented as casually as spare change. Occurring pain? SR rank, level 35. Healing reduction on every hit and a 30% chance to inflict random curses. Ash stared at the stat window with genuine surprise. The crossbow was not part of the original commission. Calibe shrugged off the praise. He had leftover materials and a forge that was still hot. Ash opened his pocket inventory, the faint blue glow cutting through the dim forge light. If Calibe could build miracles from scraps, he would feed the man every material he had. Ash offered payments so generous that even the old blacksmith hesitated. Calibe questioned whether this was too much for a bonus job, but the prince had already thought 3 moves ahead. Every material harvested from the Vampire King, every rare drop Celendian's corpse had yielded, was redirected straight to this forge. Calibe understood immediately. If the price was paid up front, no debt could be leveraged later. All the materials from the Vampire King went to Calibe. It was a fortune wrapped in monster hide, and Ash handed it over without blinking. The old man nodded once, and the negotiation was over before it started. Calibe's boots struck the stone floor as he turned to leave. He paused at the doorway and told them he would be waiting for their victory. Ash thanked him by name, and the weight of the word carried more than politeness. The party stood together now, each holding a weapon forged from the corpse of a creature that should have killed them all. Lucas, Evangeline, Damien, armed and ready. Ash announced they would also collect Evangeline's armor from the smith. She was stunned to learn he had ordered it without telling her. Her position was vanguard, and Ash had no intention of sending his front line into Stage 5 wearing last season's steel. The enemy info screen hung in the air, red and unflinching. Stage 5, 3 days and 7 hours remaining. The weapons were forged. The clock was already counting down. The fortress rooftops caught pale morning light while inside the workshop something far more practical took shape. Weeks of grinding golem armor fragments had finally paid off. The result was an SSR-grade suit of armor, level 35, capable of stacking physical and magic resistance at the cost of speed. Ash held it up with the pride of a man who had just solved a resource problem nobody else recognized. It was bulky, it was hideous, and it was exactly what Evangeline needed. He called it practical, she called it an insult. But Ash had already accounted for her vanity. Evangeline carried the unstoppable trait, a full immunity to movement-impairing effects. That meant the armor's speed penalty was meaningless on her body. She was the only soldier in his roster who could wear a fortress and still charge. Evangeline imagined gleaming silver plate like the knights from storybooks. What she received was a dark slab of golem-forged iron that made her look like a walking siege tower. Her tears could have filled the Crossroad moat. Ash watched the tantrum with the patience of a commander who had already done the math. He promised prettier armor later, then painted a silhouette of her standing victorious on a battlefield. The image worked better than any order could have. She would wear the ugly armor, but only because her prince had promised something beautiful was coming. Evangeline left the workshop with fire in her voice, swearing to exterminate every last vampire that dared approach the wall. It was bravado born from frustration, but the conviction underneath it was real. Outside, the Crossroads skyline stood unchanged, timber frames and stone walls waiting for whatever Stage 5 would bring. Ash made his way toward the manor under a violet sky. A group of armed figures waited at the gate, led by the one-eyed mercenary captain whose scars spoke louder than any introduction. Word had spread that the monster front paid well, and that the new commander was generous with coin. 5 mercenaries had come, all former colleagues of Jupiter, drawn by the rumor of a prince who spent gold like water. The one-eyed captain recalled a few months prior when Jupiter had dodged his recruitment by citing the prince's wages. He admitted it might have been an excuse, but the money turned out to be real enough to bring the rest of them running. 5 fighters, including Jupiter herself, now stood ready for contract, and every one of them had survived battlefields worse than this. But the one-eyed captain had not come just for gold. He stepped forward and told the prince plainly that he would not allow him to fight. The words landed heavier than any blade. Ash stood silent, weighing the loyalty that had walked through his gate uninvited. Jupiter broke the tension with a mercenary's pragmatism, assuring she would not burn her own body with magic the way she had in the dungeon. She was here to work, not to die. Ash regarded his growing army of misfits and mercenaries, then quietly told the kitchen to prepare 5 more servings. The manor dining hall had never seated this many. Mercenaries and retainers crowded a round table under warm lamplight, an alliance of convenience and conviction sharing the same teacups. Jupiter lifted hers with practiced nonchalance while the one-eyed captain studied the room. When Ash entered, the quiet conversation stopped. He greeted them with a thin smile and the casual authority of someone who had already decided the evening's agenda. He warned them to discuss strategy first and eat later, because what he was about to reveal might ruin their appetites. The eye-patched captain and Jupiter exchanged a glance. Neither flinched. Evangeline declared that the day she lost her appetite would be the day the world ended. Ash picked up a pointer and let the laughter fade before he delivered the blow. He drew a crude chibi figure on the blackboard and wrote the number beneath it, 1000. The boss monster of Stage 5, the Vampire King Celendian, carried 1,000 lives. Every person in the room processed that number differently. Evangeline's jaw dropped so hard it rattled the teacups. Damien asked the obvious question, whether they truly had to kill that monster 1,000 times over. Ash confirmed the impossible math, then immediately told them to forget it. Killing Celendian 1,000 times was not the plan. Finding another way was. Ash explained the nature of vampires and the mechanic that made Celendian so dangerous. Every soldier in the Vampire King's army shared its master's life pool through vampirism. When a subordinate died, Celendian simply absorbed the death and kept moving. But the connection cut both ways. In the past, Celendian's army had been wiped out entirely, and the king had refused to abandon his fallen soldiers. It was noblesse oblige taken to a suicidal extreme. Because a ruler bound his existence to his subordinates' lives, eliminating the army would drain the king's 1,000-life reserve to nothing. Ash drew the tactical diagram on the board. Step 1. Isolate and immobilize Celendian with their strongest fighters. Step 2. The rest of the army hunts down every last vampire soldier on the field. Step 3. Raid the now defenseless king and end the battle. He tapped the Chibi King on the board, crossed it out, and told them this was the general flow. Then he picked up the chalk again. He would teach them how to defeat each type of vampire individually. He told them to ingrain every word, because on the battlefield there would be no second lecture. Evangeline raised her hand and asked if they could please eat first. Ash did not dignify the request with a pause. The lecture continued for hours. By the time it ended, the room looked like a battlefield of its own. Glazed eyes, slumped shoulders, and stomachs growling in unison. The passionate strategy session had consumed every hour the kitchen had planned around. Even the mercenaries who had survived 30-year grudge wars looked ready to surrender to hunger. But Ash was not finished. He reminded them that Celendion had been devastatingly strong inside the lakeside dungeon, his home territory. This time, the battlefield was Crossroad, their fortress, their prepared ground. Stage 5 adjustments would downgrade the Vampire King. He asked them to remember every battle they had fought, every impossible wall they had broken through. The flashbacks rolled across their faces. The Spider Queen, the Demolisher, the dungeon raid that nearly buried them all. Every one of those fights had looked unwinnable from the briefing table. Damien voiced the doubt that hung in every throat, whether they could truly pull this off. Ash's expression shifted. Behind the confidence was a memory he carried alone, of battles where saving everyone had not been possible. But this time would be different. He swore it silently, then spoke the words aloud. He would not let Lucas stand alone. He would save everyone that could be saved. His hand came down on the table and the room fell still. They had 9 days until Stage 5 began. The strategy was set. Ash told them to train accordingly, and to eat well. The prince stood framed against the lit window, silhouette sharp against the Crossroad night. A single red eye gleamed from beneath dark hair, and the creature behind it whispered confirmation of something terrible. His servants had asked whether this latest attempt paid off. The answer was the same as always.
In the dim parlor of a forgotten kingdom, 2 attendants fussed over their master like parents tending a reckless child.
He recalled trying something different last time, and the maid scolded him for the mess it created. Then she mentioned cleaning the bathroom. The vampire lord stared at his servants, thoroughly unamused by their concern. There had been nothing to clean because his body simply refused to stay broken. Every wound sealed itself shut. The maid snapped into action, barking orders with the fury of someone who had done this 1,000 times. She recounted the time he jumped from the tower, and the flower bed she spent weeks replanting afterward. His name was Celendion. Every single day the vampire lord tried to die. Every attempt ended the same way. His regenerative abilities stitched him back together regardless, and his life scattered among legions made every attempt futile. He pressed clawed fingers against his face and asked how long this troublesome existence would continue. To be forced to live a life he could not even choose to end was, he confessed, true agony. The people of Lake Kingdom had destroyed themselves chasing the very immortality Celendion already possessed. The irony amused him. His servant adjusted his collar in silence. Neither of them laughed at what the kingdom had become. Celendian asked the question he asked before every campaign: whether this time he might finally be allowed to die. His attendant clarified whether he meant the coming expedition against the human surface world. The vampire lord bared his fangs in a grin and asked whether anyone truly believed humans were a match for them. The maid reminded him he had been gathering strength for a long time, but despite knowing his wish, she offered no promise. Despite knowing he wished to die, she was sorry to say she was afraid the outcome would disappoint him again. His servants bowed before him in the grand hall and pledged to remain his immortal retainers for eternity. It had been 500 years since Celendion last ventured beyond his manor. Hundreds of sleeping vampires had awakened under his banner. The doors of the manor swung wide open, bathing the hall in crimson light from the kingdom beyond. Beyond the threshold waited an army built over half a millennium, assembled and ready to march on command. The legion had grown endlessly, and each elite vampire lord commanded forces of their own within this fortress. Celendian admitted it had been quite a while since any of them visited the surface world above. His pointed-eared advisor cautioned that there was one critical obstacle they needed to account for before marching. The advisor spoke a name that made even Celendian pause. Momyung, the Nameless One. She was the last standing opponent of Lake Kingdom, a hooded warrior who practiced noblesse oblige with a blade. For 500 years she had held back every rampage single-handedly, but recently she had been pushing past her limits. The advisor believed she would not be able to stop them this time. Her centuries of resistance were finally cracking. The rest of the legion stood ready at the northern gate, assembled in perfect formation and awaiting the order. Bait troops would strike the main gate first while the true force advanced beyond the kingdom into human territory. The War Council gathered one final time to confirm a plan that would end 5 centuries of confinement. Celendian's lieutenant grinned and confessed they had already abandoned the troops designated as expendable bait. Only small factions had ever advanced beyond the kingdom, and only because one woman kept driving them back. Without the Nameless One standing guard, countless monsters would have overrun human settlements centuries ago. Celendion absorbed this quietly, his red eyes betraying nothing of the calculation turning behind them. To wipe out humanity, he declared flatly, 1,000 soldiers would be more than sufficient for the task. 10 vampires and 1,000 ghouls would march to the surface, bringing 5 centuries of hunger with them. Celendian stood perfectly still as the ground beneath him cracked with the force of approaching violence. The Nameless One arrived like a storm, screaming for the vampires' blood as payment for their betrayal of this world. She drew her blade and declared every one of them a consequence of the sins this world had committed. A single arc of freezing power scattered ghouls across the cavern floor like paper caught in a gale. Devils belonged only in Lake Kingdom, she warned, her blue eyes burning with 5 centuries of unwavering conviction. The few weapons in existence that could wound an immortal rattled in her grip as she carved through the horde. Celendian watched from across the battlefield, quietly noting she had not faltered even once in 500 years. One of his most desired ways to end his cursed life was to fall by the hand of someone truly worthy. The Nameless One called his name across the carnage, and her voice carried something far older than rage. The remaining ghouls swarmed past her guard, demanding to know where the wretched vampire lord was fleeing. Light exploded through the ancient gate, flooding the cavern with brilliance that seared undead flesh on contact. The Nameless One screamed that in time, the surface would wear him down and swallow him whole. She shattered the ghouls blocking her path and screamed his name one final time into the blinding light. But the Immortal had already passed through, walking out under a moonlit sky with his army at his back. Celendian breathed the surface air for the first time in 500 years and found it pleasant. A boot stepped firmly onto cathedral stone, echoing through the empty nave of Crossroad's temple at midnight. Ash stood in military uniform at the entrance, his cape brushing the floor behind him in the candlelight. He came not for prayer but for the one weapon no forge in Crossroad could produce for him. Saintess Margarita emerged from the interior, startled to see the prince visiting at this late hour. She was the finest healer in the entire game, the ideal hero for anyone who never reached R rank. Ash told her he was not religious. Even so, he had come to pray for the survival of those still breathing. Margarita studied him with gentle green eyes framed by her gold-trimmed veil, weighing the sincerity behind it. He placed an offering on the altar, and she noted there were no wounded party members to heal today. He addressed her by name and told her the fight against monsters was not violence, it was sacred duty. Her expression softened at the weight of his words, a faint warmth breaking through her composure. She asked him not to neglect the holy battle and to fight in it himself rather than sending others. He asked her to provide offerings frequently, to build something through the temple that raw steel could not. Margarita protested she was only a healer. She knew nothing of combat and possessed no power to fight evil. Ash stepped closer and asked her to imagine preventing wounds entirely, not mending them after the damage was done. That possibility existed if she stood beside them. He asked her directly to lend Crossroad her strength. Saintess Margarita, the best healer in the entire game, and the last piece Ash needed before the clock ran out. Because somewhere beyond the temple walls, An immortal who longed for death was already walking toward Crossroad with 1,000 soldiers behind him.